Hi everyone, I am Jill Cabrera together with the members of Group 2, Miss Jenny Solis, Miss Maria Jessa Magdasok, Miss Kathy Kinghandog, and Miss Nancy Dumugho. For this video, we will discuss the topics under Module 1, Lesson 2, Authentic Classroom Assessment.
Before we proceed with the lesson proper, let us first consider the specific learning outcomes. For effective, make connections between the principles of high-quality assessment and the development and use of authentic assessment techniques and tools within and across teaching areas. For skill, develop authentic classroom assessments. And for knowledge, differentiate authentic and traditional assessment.
The first topic that I will be discussing is about why use authentic assessment. But before that, I want everybody to ponder on these questions. Why should teachers use authentic assessment? And what is its significance to the students and their learning? You can comment your answers below. Why use authentic assessment? The question why use authentic assessment is not meant to suggest that you have to choose between traditional assessments such as tests and more authentic or performance assessments. Often, teachers use a mix of traditional and authentic assessments to serve different purposes. This section then attempts to explain why teachers might use or might choose authentic assessments for certain types of judgments and why authentic assessments have become more popular in recent years. The additional sources provided an authentic assessment toolbox in which we are going to learn about the reasons why teachers should use authentic assessment in the classroom. The first one is authentic assessments are direct measures. We do not just want students to know the content of the disciplines when they graduate. We, of course, want them to be able to use the acquired knowledge and skills in the real world. So, our assessments have to also tell us if students can apply what they have learned in authentic situations. If a student does well on a test of knowledge, we might infer that the student could also apply that knowledge. But that is rather indirect evidence. I could more directly check for the ability to apply by asking the students to use what they have learned in some meaningful way. So consider these examples. If the lesson is about ecotourism or appreciating the beauty of nature, the teacher could implement field trips so that the students could go and explore around the nature and appreciate it. If the teacher wants the students to improve their communication skill, the teacher could employ or engage them to interview activities or public speaking. If the teacher is teaching about technology or computer, then it is evident to use hands-on activities or to engage them to real-world activities such as using computers, real computers. We don't just settle for objective tests. We have to go beyond and let the learners explore and engage themselves into real-world contexts. Similarly, if we want to know if our students can interpret literature, calculate potential savings on sale items, test a hypothesis, develop a fitness plan, converse in a foreign language, or apply other knowledge and skills they have learned, then authentic assessments will provide the most direct evidence. The second one is authentic assessments capture constructive nature of learning. A considerable body of research on learning has found that we cannot simply be fed knowledge. We need to construct our own meaning of the world using information we have gathered and were taught and our own experiences with the world. That's according to Bransford and V. 1989, Foreman and Krashner 1977, Neisser 1967, Steffi and Gale 1995, and Whitrock 1991. Thus, assessments cannot just ask students to repeat back information they have received. Students must also be asked to demonstrate that they have accurately constructed meaning about what they have been taught, critical analysis of a text or research. Furthermore, students must be given the opportunity to engage in the construction of meaning. Authentic tasks not only serve as assessments but also as vehicles for such learning. The third one is authentic assessments integrate teaching, learning, and assessment. Authentic assessment, in contrast to more traditional assessment, encourages the integration of teaching, learning, and assessing. In the traditional assessment model, teaching and learning are often separated from assessment. A test is administered after knowledge or skills have hopefully been acquired by the students. In the authentic assessment model, the same authentic task used to measure the student's ability to apply the knowledge or skills is used as a vehicle for student learning. For example, when presented with a real-world problem to solve, students are learning in the process of developing a solution. Teachers are facilitating the process, and the student's solutions to the problem becomes an assessment of how well the students can meaningfully apply the concepts. The fourth one states that authentic assessments provide multiple paths to demonstration. We all have different strengths and weaknesses in how we learn. Similarly, we are different in how we can best demonstrate what we have learned. Regarding the traditional assessment model, answering multiple choice questions does not allow for much variability in how students demonstrate the knowledge and skills they have acquired. On the other hand, that is a strength of tests because it makes sure everyone is being compared on the same domains in the same manner, which increases the consistency and comparability of the measure. On the other hand, testing favors those who are better test takers and does not give students any choice in how they believe they can best demonstrate what they have learned. By carefully identifying the criteria of good performance on the authentic task ahead of time, the teacher can still make comparable judgments of student performance even though student performance might be expressed quite differently from student to student. For example, the products students create to demonstrate authentic learning on the same task might take different forms. Example, posters, oral presentations, videos, or websites. Or even though students might be required to produce the same authentic product, there can be room within the product for different modes of expression. For example, writing a good persuasive essay requires a common set of skills from students, but there is still room for variation in how that essay is constructed. Thus, it is recommended, example given by Wiggins 1998, that multiple and varied assessments be used so that 1. A sufficient number of samples are obtained, multiple, and 2. A sufficient variety of measures are used or varied. Variety of measurement can be accomplished by assessing the students through different measures that allows you to see them apply what they have learned in different ways and from different perspectives. Typically, you will be more confident in the student's grasp of the material if they can do so. But some variety of assessment can also be accomplished within a single measure. Authentic tasks tend to give the students more freedom in how they will demonstrate what they have learned. Those are the reasons provided in the Authentic Assessment Toolbox of why should teachers use authentic assessment in the classroom. I hope you have learned something from the discussion. Now let us proceed to the principles of authentic assessment that will be discussed to us by my groupmate, Miss Nancy Dumugho from BE Ed.
Hi everyone, my name is Nancy Tubog Dumugho from BE Ed 3. My topic for today's video is all about principles of authentic assessment. So number 1 is focus on what really matters. Are the criteria we are using consciously or not to judge students' work reflective of the most important educational objectives? So assessment that are skewed towards a limited range of desired outcomes. So the teacher need to assess the important implication for what students consider important and ultimately they learn. So we need to stick on our purpose for the students to gain learnings and to make it effective. So for example, outcomes related exclusively to factual knowledge fail to assess and possible inadvertently discourage student growth along other desired outcomes. So the second one is authentic assessment provide valid indications. It defined as a close fit between the kinds of attributes actually measured by an assessment device and the intended educational goals. Or we can say that our assessment strategy is valid if it actually assesses the outcomes it claims to assess. So we need to assess students' ability to identify and use multiple sources of information. So we should give the students a real task to find out if they had gained any understanding of the topic. So for me, I would have been better advised to ask students to tell me orally in their own words what they had found out. So the third one is use assessment to support learning. In a study, Assessment Reform Group 2002, it was concluded students would be better motivated and learn more on supporting learning in at least 4 other important ways in case 2013. So, greater validity of assessment measures is in itself an attempt to use assessment to support learning. So, clearly communicate expectation. So, meaning to say, if the students know clearly what is expected of them, so they are more likely to succeed at the task. And also, it provides feedback on learning. So, we can enhance learning by helping students see how they might improve. So, for example, the teacher gives an assessment and they will be able to do it. And after that, you give feedback on what they do to improve. So, this will help them to understand what they did well and where more attention was needed. So, if we want our students to improve, our feedback must clearly communicate what has been successfully done, where improvement is needed, and how to do this. Involve students in assessment. So, involving students directly in the assessment process is another way to support learning. So, for example, creating assessment tasks. So, it is the other way to involve students by inviting them to assist in developing the task upon which they will be assessed. And another example is self and peer assessment. So this can greatly enhance their learning. So the last principle is develop assessment that uses teachers' time efficiently. So although efficiency has no immediate relationship to authentic assessment, it is had to apply changes. However, desirable if they are more time consuming. So, for example, the student peer and self-assessment. So this can save teacher time because the students provided adequately trained in the practice. So it saves time because it means that students are giving each other feedback that otherwise the teacher would have to give. So, developing students' abilities to assess their own work and their peers' work may be one of the more efficient learning strategies. So, thank you so much for listening.
Now let's move on to traditional assessment vis-a-vis or compared to authentic assessment. So I have here words and box, and I want you to categorize the words above the box if it is authentic assessment or traditional assessment. And after that, we will going to compare the two. So I guess you are done answering the two. Now let's move on knowing if you got a correct answer. So we have here in traditional assessment, as you can see, selecting a response, contrive, recall recognition, teacher structured, indirect evidence, and convergent. And in authentic assessment, we have here performing a task, real life, construction application, student structured, direct evidence, and divergent. So now let's move on comparing the two. So, selecting a response to performing a task. So, in traditional assessment, students are typically given several choices such as A, B, C, D, or true or false. And which of these match with those and asked to select the right answer. In contrast, authentic assessment, we ask students to demonstrate understanding by performing a more complex task, usually representative of more meaningful application. Now let's move on to contrive to real life. So, it is not very often in life outside of school that we are asked to select from four alternatives to indicate our proficiency at something. So tests offer this contrived means as of assessment to increase the number of times you can be asked to demonstrate proficiency in a short period of time. More commonly in life, as in authentic assessments, we are asked to demonstrate proficiency by doing something. Now, let's move on to recall or recognition of knowledge to construction or application of knowledge. Well-designed traditional assessment, example as tests and quizzes, can effectively determine whether or not students have acquired a body of knowledge. Thus, as mentioned above, tests can serve as a nice complement to authentic assessments in a teacher's assessment portfolio. Furthermore, we are often asked to recall or recognize facts and ideas and proposition in life, so tasks are somewhat authentic in that sense. However, the demonstration of recall and recognition on tasks is typically much less revealing about what we really know and can do than when we are asked to construct a product or perform out of facts, ideas, and proposition. Authentic assessment often asks students to analyze, synthesize, and apply what they have learned in a substantial manner, and students create new meaning in a process as well. Now, let's move on to teacher structured to student structured. So when complete so when completing a traditional assessment, what a student can and will demonstrate has been carefully structured by the person who developed the task. A student's attention will understandably be focused on and limited to what is on the task. In contrast, authentic assessments allow more students' choice and construction in determining what is presented in evidence as proficiency. Even when students cannot choose their own topics or formats towards constructing a product or performance, obviously, assessments more carefully controlled by the teachers offer advantages and disadvantages. Similarly, more student-structured tasks have strengths and weaknesses that must be considered when choosing and designing an assessment. Now, let's move on to indirect evidence to direct evidence. So even if a multiple choice question asks a student to analyze or apply facts to a new situation, rather than just to recall the facts and the student selects the correct answer, what do you now know about that student? Did that student get lucky and pick the right answer? What thinking led the student to pick the answer? We really do not know. At best, we can make some inference about what the students might know and might be able to do with the knowledge. The evidence is very indirect, particularly for claims of meaningful application in complex or real-world situations. Authentic assessments, on the other hand, offer more direct evidence of application and construction of knowledge. As if the golf example above, putting a golf student on the golf course to play provides much more direct evidence of proficiency than giving the student a written task. Can a student effectively critique the arguments someone else has presented? An important skill often required in a real world, right? So asking a student to write critique should provide more direct evidence of the skill than asking the student a series of multiple choice analytical questions about a passage, although both assessments may be useful. And lastly, we have the convergent and divergent. So convergent aims to discover whether the learner exhibits knows, understanding, or can do a predetermined thing. On the other hand, divergent aims to discover what the learners know or understand or can do. So teachers do not have to select between authentic and traditional assessment. There's no right or wrong in assessing students' learning. Both traditional and authentic can work together to understand or better understand how well students absorb information. So that would be all, and thank you.
Good day, everyone. So, in continuation with Miss Kathy King Handog's report, I will be now discussing a new topic, and this will be about the five-dimensional framework of or for authentic design. So, the first one is task. An authentic task is a problem task that confronts students with activities that are also carried out in professional practice. So the fact that an authentic task is crucial for an assessment is undisputed or unquestionable, meaning it is widely accepted by students and learners, as students and teachers, or in learning education in general. So assessment tasks or authentic assessments require students to integrate skills, knowledge, and authentic task works. Authentic tasks are more into real life problems, and these are somehow related to professional works or professionalism. So authentic activities comprise complex tasks to be investigated by students over a sustained period of time. So these activities are completed in days, weeks, or even months, rather than minutes or hours. So they require significant investment of time and intellectual resources. Okay, diba? These tasks are carried out in professional context or professionals. And professionals are already dealing with real-life problems, and no real-life problems are solved within minutes or hours. The second dimensional framework is physical context. The physical context of an authentic assessment should reflect the way knowledge, skills, and attitudes will be used in professional practice. So, in physical context, you have here the definition. I have quoted a part of the definition, which is reflect the way knowledge, skills, and attitudes will be used in professional practice. So this actually refers to how we do something in a real life, in a real place, or in a real environment. And an example for this would be such as the military mechanic. So if we say that a person is a military but he's not in his work, so meaning he's practicing. He's still practicing his skills as a mechanic. So the best environment for him to fix a car or any vehicle is his garage. Since we all know that a garage would be the best way, since it is complete, it has the complete equipments or tools we have. So now he's fixing his car in his garage. But when in real life situation, or when he's already in his work, he will be at war, he will be fixing his vehicle in the war, or during the war. So that means he's not in his garage. And the most crucial thing would be is that he has no complete tools. He does not have his tools, just like how he has everything in his garage. So that is a real life situation, or a physical context in which authentic task or authentic assessment is being done. So in real life situation, we won't be expecting that our tools and equipments will be complete, just like how we used to have we used to do before we used to have before at our own home. So it is different. It is a different situation when we are in a real life environment, or in the physical context of the where the authentic assessment is done, and where we usually do our work, which is our home. So an important element of the authenticity of physical context is that the number and kinds of resources available. So these resources may contain relevant or irrelevant information. Now we have the social context. A model for authentic assessment should consider social processes that are evident in real life context. What is really important in an authentic assessment is that the social processes of the assessment is similar to the social processes of the corresponding real life situation. Now let's move on to the third dimensional framework, which is the social context. So social context is somehow similar to physical context, wherein the term itself, social, means how we socialize with others to get our works done. So in real life, working together is often the rule rather than the exception. It is also emphasized by Resnick that learning and performing out of school mostly takes place in a social platform. So although collaboration is not a characteristic of authentic assessment, our research argues that if the real situation demands collaboration, the assessment should need or should have collaboration. But if that assessment requires individual work, so that would only mean that that work should be individual and not to be collaborated with others. The fourth framework is assessment result or form. An authentic result or form is characterized by four elements. It should be a quality product or performance that students can be asked to produce in real life. Demonstration that permits making valid inferences about the underlying competencies. Full array of tasks and multiple indicators of learning in order to come to fair conclusions, and work students present to other people, either orally or in written form, because it is important that they defend their work to ensure that their apparent mastery is genuine. The fourth dimensional framework we have here is the assessment result or form. So this is quite understandable in our part. It is just simply the result of the assessment. It is the form or result of the assessment that we gave our students or we have done. So the assessment result is related to the kind and amount of output of the assessment task, independent of the content of the assessment. So simply put, assessment result is a log of marks or grades earned by the student for or from a specific assessment. So these assessment results are important evidences on which to base requests for funding, make curriculum changes, rethink faculty lines, and more. So that means if we have our students' assessment results, we will know in which aspect or which part of their skills or their knowledge needs improvement or needs development so that we can help them. Disappointing or negative assessment results can have a positive effect when they are used to improve the learning process. The last dimensional framework we have here is the criteria and standards. So from the words itself, criteria and standards, these are somehow the goals that we need our students to achieve, or these are some of the goals that us teachers need our students to achieve. So these are maybe done or maybe a result from their grades or ages of students, depending on the the instructional materials that you will be using. So criteria and standards are those characteristics of the assessment result that are valued, while standards are the level of performance expected from various grades and ages of students. So this will somehow serve as our basis if that student doesn't reach the standard or the criteria that we've given them. This may only mean that they still need improvement, and from that part of or that aspect wherein they did not meet the standards or they did not complete the criteria is where they need development, and that is also where we need or we will come in to help them and support them to have their improvement and development a success too. Now that ends my report for the 5-dimensional frameworks of or for authentic assessment. Again, we have task, we have physical context, social context, we have assessment result or form, and criteria and standards. So the next reporter will be Chini Solis, and she will be discussing a new topic.
Good morning, classmates. I am Chini Solis, the last reporter for Lesson 2. So now we are down to how to create an authentic assessment. So before we proceed to the proper discussion, may we answer this question first? For you, what is authentic? So I know na, sige nang gabalik-balik din na question, no? For you to know that this question serve as a review for me to find out or for me to know na naajud mo nakatonan from the previous discussion, because authentic assessment is what we will going to focus on today's topic. If you want to answer, please comment your answer on the comment section below. Now let's proceed to next slide. So I have here 3 definitions of authentic assessment, and these are from 3 proponent authors. So for the first one, authentic assessment is a form of assessment in which students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills, and this is from John Miller. So, according to Muller, students are to engage in real-world tasks that showcase their acquired knowledge and skills. So, when we say real-world, these are the problems that are inherently engaging since they tend to be meaningful and applicable to students' life either directly or indirectly. So, for now, can I have some examples of real-world tasks? Put your answer on the comment section below. So, for me, the real-world samples of real-world tasks are conducting a research study or a case study, doing a project proposal, or engaging my students to community work such as service learning. So in that way, students are to face the reality we're gonna face unsay mga nahitabo outside the campus. Okay? So that is the real world task. Another definition, according to Wiggins, authentic assessment engaging and worthy problems or questions of importance in which students must use knowledge to fashion performances effectively and creatively. The tasks are either replicas or analogous to the kinds of problems faced by adult citizens and consumers. According to Wigan, students are to engage in worthy problems that are found in society, which will showcase their analytical and critical thinking. So, for example, I will task my student to do a project proposal. So, my students will find problems within or outside the school, then they will create a project proposal to solve that problem. Another is conducting a research study in which they will interview people outside the campus to gather information that will be disseminated to the class. And they will apply what they have learned from the discussion and also from the interview as well. So now for the last definition. According to Stevens, authentic assessments is a performance assessment called upon the examined to demonstrate specific skills and competencies, that is to apply the skills and knowledge that they have mastered. So according to Stevens, authentic assessments are the performance assessment where students will demonstrate specific skills and competencies. So again, what would be the examples of performance assessments? So we have here the role play, the creating portfolio, and conducting a laboratory investigation. So creating a portfolio is a performance because it will assess the students' creativity. Okay. So those are the definitions of authentic assessment. Now we all move to how to create an authentic assessment. So fortunately, you do not have to develop an authentic assessment from scratch. You may be already using authentic tests in your classroom, or you may already have the standard written, and the standard written is the first and most important step in the process. Perhaps you have a task, but you need to more clearly articulate the criteria for evaluating students' performance on the task, or you may want to develop a rubric for the task. So, we have here a question number 1. Basically, this is a first step. So, this is the question that to be asked. What should students know and able to do? So before you come up with the authentic task, you have to list all the knowledge and skills that students must achieve, and those lists of knowledge and skills becomes your standard. So basically, this is the first step, creating or formulating the standard. So again, what is a standard? So standard involves reflecting on, writing down, and determining what the goals for your student, for example, learning outcomes. Standard can be one-sentence statements or phrases of what students should know and are able to do at some point. So an assessment cannot produce a valid inferences unless it measures what is intended to measure. In other words, an assessment will not be reliable or accurate without intended to measure, and it cannot measure what is intended to measure unless the goals has been clearly identified. So completing the rest of the following steps will be unproductive without clear goals for student learning. So, in other words, standard is one of the most important process of creating an authentic assessment. Kay through standards, diha ka magbase kung unsay applicable authentic task ana niya, no? So, ang kanang nga standard dapat pud clearly identified siya, naa po siya direction, no? So, standard, like goals, are statements of what students should know and able to do. However, standards are typically more narrow in scope and more amenable to assessment than goals. So, I have here some example of standard. First is student will be able to add two-digit numbers, identify the causes and consequences of the Revolutionary War, and explain the process of photosynthesis. So, mo ni siya standard. later on kanang magama mo og authentic task, you must come up with a standard first nga ingani siya no, ingani forma. So now let's move on to second step, the questions to be asked. What indicates students have met this standard? So to determine if students have met these standards, you will design or select relevant authentic tasks. So in the second step, authentic task determines how will you know students have met the standards written in step 2. After you come up with the standards, you will now create an authentic task that is associated to the intended learning outcome. So as we make an authentic task, as a teacher, we must consider the learning style or the learning preference of our students. Not all students are the same. We must come up with activities that is appropriate and available to all students. No, as a teacher, dapat kabalog ta kung unsay kinaiya or unsay mga skills or mga learning preference sa aton students for us to adjust or for us to create a differentiated activities para fair siya sa mga students, no? If we are only conducted with the type of constructed response task, it is not fair to those students who are creative, who are fond of performing, who are preferable to learn through visual o mga anak nga mga students. Not all students are fond of writing. May students nga dili gud sila ginahan, dili gud maon na ilahang way of learning. Ginahan gud sila katugong through visuals, to mag-perform gud sila, no? So as a teacher, dapat gud magama og mga differentiated activities para fair sa mga students. So I have here 3 types of authentic tasks: constructed, production, and performance. So constructed response is where students will construct response out of the previously learned and newly learned knowledge. Motto, constructed response, pwede sila magama og essay, reflection, journal, article. For the production, students create a deliverable that demonstrate their ability to apply, analyze, and synthesize what they have learned. So, pwede na sila magama diri og mga portfolio or katong students nga mga creative, like gama sila og collage, slogan, or mga any artistic nga mga activities to enhance students' creativity. So, and last is performance. Students perform a task that demonstrate their ability to apply, analyze, and synthesize what they have learned. So, for the word performance, dili na tong mga students nga who are fond of like katong ginahan good mo tayada sa atubangan. For example, kanang role play, public speaking, or interpretive dance, kanang mga ingana nga kanang mga nga activities. Okay? So I have here an example of standard. So students will describe the geographic, economic, social, and political consequences of the Revolutionary War. So what would be the appropriate authentic task for this? So in step 2, you want to find a way students can demonstrate what they are fully capable of meeting the standards. The language of a well-written standards can spell out what a task should ask students to demonstrate their mastery of it. So, can you describe the geographic, economic, social, and political consequences of the Revolutionary War? The applicable authentic task for this is students will make an analytic paper or a multimedia presentation where students will develop through individual or collaboratively, or a debate they participate in, or even an essay question on a test. So those are the applicable authentic tasks for that standard. Okay, so now let's move on to step 3. Questions to be asked. What does good performance on this task look like? To determine if students have performed well on the task, you will identify and look for characteristics of a good performance called criteria. So, in step 1, naka-identify na ka what your students to know and able to do. In step 2, you selected a task that students would perform or produce to demonstrate that they have met the standards from step 1. For step 3, you want to ask, what does good performance on this task look like? Or how will I know that my students have done a good job on this task? So, in answering those questions, you will be identifying the criteria for good performance on that task. You will use those criteria to evaluate how will students completed the task, and thus how well they have met the standard or standards. So let us first define what is criteria. So criteria establishes indicators of a good performance on the authentic task selected in step 2. Students must achieve these criteria when completing authentic tasks to not only demonstrate what they have learned, but they are also capable of effectively applying what they have learned. So I have here an example. This is a standard from special education collection. So, yung standard is the students will conduct a banking transaction. So, unsa kahay mga applicable authentic task ani? So, the teacher assigned a task to make deposits, withdrawals, or cash checks at the bank. So, kani siya, it is authentic assessment, no? It because the students are going to engage in real world tasks. So, ang students mismo ang muanha agud sa bangko para sila good nga para good para good ma-learn gud sila kung unsa goy process in depositing, in withdrawal, or kanang cash check sa bangko, no? So, ing ani nga task, syempre naago na siya criteria. So, to identify the criteria for a good performance on this task, the teacher asks herself, what would good performance on this task look like? So, unsa kahay basihan nga makaingon ko nga good performance ning gihimo sa estudyante. So, she came up with 7 essential characteristics for successful completion of the task. So, muna yahang criteria. So, first is selects the needed from deposits or withdrawal, fills in the form of necessarily information, endorsers check, locates open teller, states type of transaction, counts money to be deposited to teller, and puts money received in wallet. So if students meet this criteria, then they have performed well on the task and thus have met the standard, or at least provided some evidence of meeting the standard. So mo to siya ang imong paghimo og criteria. You will list the characteristics of the characteristics nga depende kung unsay imong gigama nga standard. Now let's move on to the last step. Question to be asked: how well did the students perform? To determine among student performance across criteria, you will create a rubric. So, what is a rubric? So, rubric is a 4th step that measures the student's performance on the authentic task. Rubrics are essential for structuring an authentic assessment. To start building the rubric, use the criteria established in step 3 and then decide whether to create an analytic rubric or holistic rubric. Okay? So, question. What is the difference between holistic and analytic rubric? So you can answer, or you can put your answer on the comment section below. So going back, analytic rubric is used when the performance will be evaluated each criterion, while an holistic rubric is used when all the criteria are evaluated together or holistically. So, before mo come up o rubric, dapat mo come up sa puka o criteria. Kay, ang rubric is nagbase man siya sa criteria, no? So, again, to summarize the step, sa step 1, naka-determine naka-identify what you wanted your students to know and able to do. So, mo na tong standard. In step 2, You ask how students could demonstrate what they have met your standards, and as a result, you will develop authentic tasks that they could perform. So in step 3, you identify the characteristics of a good performance on the authentic task, the criteria. Now in step 4, you will finish creating the authentic task by constructing a rubric to measure student performance on the task. To build the rubric, you will begin with a set of criteria you identified in step 3. So as mentioned before, keep the number of criteria manageable. You don't have to look for everything on every assessment. So once you have identified the criteria you want to look for as an indicators of a good performance, you next decide whether to consider the criteria analytically or holistically. So given the differentiated definitions of analytic o holistic, no? So for now, I will discuss to you kung usa gud ang analytic ug holistic. So let's first define what is analytic. An analytic rubric performance is judged separately for each criterion. Teacher assess how well students meet a criterion on a task, distinguishing between work that effectively meets the criterion and work does not meet it. Generally, it's better to start small with fewer levels because it is usually harder to make more fine distinction. For eye contact, Personally, I might begin with the 3 levels such as never, sometimes, and usually. Then, if in apply the rubric, I found that some students seem to fall in between never and sometimes, and never or sometimes did not adequately describe the student's performance. So, I could add the 4th, for example, rarely, and possibly a 5th level to the rubric. So I have here an example of analytic. So I can say nga di analytic guni siya, no, because each characteristic is being evaluated. For example, each criteria. So for example, make good observation. So made good prediction, appropriate conclusion. So kada usa nila evaluate ko na siya, either limited ba siya, observation are absent or vague, or acceptable ba siya, or most observation are clear and detailed, or proficient pa siya, all observations are clearly and detailed. So again, this is analytic because each criteria is being evaluated. Now let's move on to holistic. In a holistic rubric, a judgment of how well someone has performed on a task considers all the criteria together or holistically instead of separately in analytic rubric. So, in contrast to the analytic rubric nga each criterion are being evaluated, there is sa holistic is gitigom na sila, overall evaluated na tanang tong criterion. So, here is the example. So, this is for oral presentation rubric. So, sa mastery, sa proficiency, sa developing, ug sa inadequate, overall na siya, no? Now let's move on to the last part. So here in the rubric, you will determine how well should most students perform. The minimum level at which you would want most students to perform is your cut score or benchmark. Then through rubric, you will also determine what do students need to improve upon. Information from the rubric will give students feedback and allow you to adjust instruction. So again, through rubric, diya nimo ma-identify kung effective ba ang imuhang instructional materials or imuhang pedagogy in teaching. Because the result of your authentic task will determine whether kinahanglan ba nimo nga either kailangan ba nimong usbon ang imuhang instruction or imuhang method of teaching, or kailangan ba nimong i-improve pa. So here are the summary of all of those tests. So to sum it up, first step is to identify your standards for your students. Second step, for a particular standard or a set of standard, develop a task your students could perform that will indicate that they have met the standards. And for step 3, identify the characteristics of a good performance on a task, the criteria that if present in your students' work will indicate that they have performed well on the task too. And in the task, they have met the standard. For each criterion, identify two or more levels of performance along which will sufficiently determine among students' performance of that criteria. The combination of criteria and the levels of performance for each criterion will be rubric for that assessment. So that ends of my report. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have learned from my discussion. Thank you and God bless you all.